How do companies like Instagram, Duolingo, and Spotify create apps that wow their customers every single day? Maleea, a UX researcher joining us today, has the answers. With a diverse background in education and digital marketing that took her all the way to South Korea, she's transformed her curiosity into a career that challenges the norms and uncovers valuable insights. And today I'll be hoping to get, some of those insights that took her from a psychology grad into tech, along with advice on how to stand out in UX research. Welcome to the live stream.
Thank you so much for having me.
So basically, like the very first question is, why did you go from psychology to tech?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, when I was getting my degree in psychology, I didn't know anything about UX or tech, even for that matter. I actually remember there was maybe one course where it was about some intersection of psychology and technology, but I didn't really know what that was at that point. As you mentioned, I lived in South Korea for some time, and I had a very untraditional path getting into to tech as a whole. But I suppose it was a mixture of doing very similar things in my job in South Korea as a digital media manager. So I was taking a look at users and products from a user perspective, but it wasn't quite UX. It's not what we were calling it at that point. And also, when I came back from South Korea, so I was living there, I came back to America so that I could pursue a career in something, right? And I had decided to actually take a look at tech because a very close friend of mine had reached out and said, "Hey, I know that you just came back from living in South Korea. You are trying to find out what your next move is." She was an engineer, and so she said, "Hey, take a look at some tech roles. Maybe engineering's for you, or maybe it's something else." And I took a little bit of a look, right, trying to understand, like, okay, is software engineering for me, right? Like, I don't know, maybe is it? And I stumbled upon UX, and UX in particular is a lot of, and especially when thinking about research, it's very psychology. It has its roots in psychology, but it's also bridging it with technology to understand how do users or humans, even if I want to take it one step further, how do humans use products and how can we make them more usable for users or better or whatever that piece needs to be, and each company has different needs. So I would say that's kind of how I got into it.
I'm sure, like the way I set it up in the beginning, you must have been wondering, like, where is he going, right? But ultimately, I think you captured it like really well. Uh, Even asking the question, like, immediately jumps out at me because I think maybe to even help even people understand it a little better. For many apps or consumer facing apps, like you're ultimately trying to guess what the user wants. You're trying to figure out, what's going to make them tick. And in your role, it's putting science behind that assumption, essentially, and testing out those different ideas to figure out what works. So it actually does make a lot of sense that, this is actually the background. So, you
Hmm.
know, that journey itself, right? So to deciding and figuring out like this was a fit, what did that look like for you? And for example, were there other options that you considered before finally settling on this one?
Yeah, definitely. So when I came back from living in South Korea, I had mentioned to you that I wanted to start a career. And so I had actually decided that I was going to pursue a master's degree in industrial organization psychology, kind of like the next step for some psych majors, right? And so I actually started that, and I found out about UX around the same time, though. I'm somebody who like keeps going. I didn't really take a break at this point, so I started learning about UX as I was also going through with my master's program. I had gone through maybe a few months of doing both at the same time, which was quite a lot. And I basically decided to take a bet on myself. And I was like, I need to figure out which thing I'm going to bet on, or which risk am I going to take that's going to help me actually progress and move forward. And I had decided that I wanted to use the boot camp as that medium instead of the master's program. So I went through with the boot camp, and to be very frank and honest, the boot camp was a design focused boot camp, like a UX design. So it actually took a little bit more finagling on my side to understand if I wanted to do design or if I wanted to go the research route. With my background in research, I decided that that was probably the best route for me. And I actually spent some time really taking the pieces from that, from the boot camp, the case studies, taking the research pieces out so that I can actually use them to present myself as that researcher. And yeah, I would say that that's kind of how I went about doing it. There was a couple different ways, right? I could have went the master's way. I could have done the boot camp, but actually did it in the design aspect. But this was the path that I decided to go down.
So, one of the things that you touch on that I would like to double click on is the fact that you realize that what you had signed up for wasn't necessarily what you really wanted to do, but you still had to figure out a way to make it work. What does that look like, and what did you have to do to augment that learning?
Yeah, yeah. For the boot camp, it took me learning design in order for me to understand if I wanted to proceed with design or research. So I come from a research background with, with thinking about methods and methodology. And so that was very second nature for me. But coming into design, I literally had to, learn the tools, learn how to create these pieces in order for me to truly understand. And I'm somebody who likes to do because that helps me just get the full picture. And so after quite literally doing that work, I said, okay, if I wanted to make a career out of this, what would be my best path forward? And it when thinking about the curve for me, how much more I would have needed to learn for design in order for me to feel confident in getting a role anytime soon, it would have taken some time. So I essentially decided to just focus on the research aspects instead.
And you talk about something now that I found really valuable, because I see a lot of people trying to transition into new tech careers, spending a lot of time on research, analysis, paralysis, instead of actually doing the actual work.
Mhm.
Because there's a lot of value in learning the things that you actually don't want to do, right?
Yeah.
Than actually just thinking about it, or just, imagining things. Because ultimately, I think figuring out that you didn't really want to do that probably puts you on a better path to actually doing the thing that you really wanted to do.
Hmm.
So, with that in mind, just double clicking, I think something else I want to maybe get understand a little better, because I do have my thoughts on it, but I definitely want to get yours. It's like how important it is to lean, because for a lot of people who are transitioning into tech, there's going to be some experience that you bring or some skill set. How important it is to lean on a lot of those things rather than like going off on a tangent, essentially.
Ooh, it's a good question. I think that it depends on what you want to do, if I'm very, very honest. But for the bulk of us, I will make this assumption right now that we want to get the skill set that we need so that we are able to work in that space. So, um, I'm sorry, could you reiterate the question? I had like a few things popping in my head, and I want to make sure that I get the answer.
Yeah, I definitely want to get your thoughts as much as possible around the subject, but it's like how important is it to lean on the
Mhm.
things that you already have as a skill, experience, etc., versus like going to do something new.
I think it's really important. When thinking about tech and like thinking about someone who wants to transition into tech but actually doesn't know where to start, leaning on your skills is the easiest thing that you can do from the bat, right? What skill set do you have and what do you bring to the table? That is going to be the crux of what you do actually, because if you think about it, even if I had decided to go with design, my roots would have still been in research. So I still would have been like a design researcher, or like, I would have been in the interim or in between rather than like one or the other, but that skill is still very much so useful and needed for me. So I think that leaning in is incredibly important, and especially when you're trying to make the transition once you've already had some work experience. So that's also a different dichotomy, right? You could be like entry level coming in with no experience. That's going to look a little bit different of how you're going to position yourself. But for those of us who have had work experiences and have done things, it's just not in tech. It's all about what you have done and reshaping it to so that it fits the use case of technology.
That's amazing. So, having like that global experience in South Korea must have played a part in your journey. What, if you look back now and kind of like connect the dots, how did that shape, the career that you have today?
Mhm. I would say that being able to live in a different country affords a lot for people. Um, I feel like I don't even know the extent of all of the things that I truly gained from living outside the country, but I would say communication, huge, especially in the space of design, because it's all about articulating your design or articulating your reasoning behind why this design happened, which is the research part, and living somewhere where you need to figure out how you're going to communicate with people. We don't all speak English, or maybe even in this case, we don't all speak Korean. And so finding those ways of connecting with folks, even through nonverbal ways or just other means, I think has really helped me. It's helped me to be able to connect on a deeper level with my teammates and to better understand them as well, because it's not about just the spoken word that's being said. It's about how I perceive them in their body language, or the way that they said it rather than the thing that they actually said. All of these things were pieces that I had to work with when living in a different country of like, I said that, let's say we're speaking Korean and I said that, but what is your body language? Like, how did you actually perceive that? And it's very sensitive to that being in a different country. But being back home in America, of course, we don't have that much of that problem here, but I do think that I take special care to try to really understand people and feel them as well, and that just helps me to connect on a deeper level.
What's so interesting about that piece is, a lot of like this misnomer a little bit about communication, where people say like, I'm responsible for what I say, but not what you hear. But I think like given that perspective that you share, it's that the importance of communication is to be understood. So if what you're saying is being taken in a wrong way, well,
You
some
should
responsibility
understand me.
might be
Mhm.
on the person who's receiving. But I think as a UX researcher with that skill set, you understand like the value of not even creating that, room for misinterpretation. Because like I think in the world of consumer products, that just means like disinterest. Like if somebody can't really understand what this is supposed to do, they just leave. Like
They
they're not
won't
gonna
use
say,
it.
hey,
It's not usable. Yeah, exactly.
so you've had roles across companies like Google, Walmart, and now PayPal. So you know how talk me a little bit through like that transition and journey to landing your first role, and now you've been able to make that progression.
Yeah. So my first role was at Google, and that was a contract role. I believe I found that just scouring the internet looking for roles, and that was actually a funny story because I remember I found this role posted on like a Google group somewhere, and it was a Saturday. So I was like, "Ooh, a Saturday. Should I even put the time in to apply right now? Should I just wait until Monday?" I was like, I'll just go ahead and apply now. I'm ready." So I sent in my resume, my portfolio, everything's fine. I mentioned it's Saturday, right? Monday comes, and the hiring manager makes another post under her post to say that she has received all of the applications that she needs by Monday morning. So that means had I waited until Monday morning, I would not even have been eligible to apply, right? She wouldn't have even received it. Um, Funny thing about that is I had actually I got the interview, of course, because I got that role, but I had asked them kind of like, what's the time frame that you guys were looking at? And they were like, "Oh, you were the first one to apply, so you're the first one we're interviewing." And it just goes to show just being prepared and being ready really will help you. But you have to be prepared and ready, right, in order to put yourself out there. But that was key for me getting started. So I worked there for about a year. I know that we talk a lot about users as like end users and end consumers, but in that role, I was actually doing a lot with developers. and merchants. So they are also users, right? So that's like some additional complexity that, you know, that exists. I went from Google over to Walmart, where I worked on the Walmart Plus team for a hot second. I was only there for just a few months, just doing some very basic work there until I was essentially scooped up to be at PayPal. So I've been at PayPal now for a year and some change, maybe a month or so. And yeah, that experience, I would have to say that me getting into PayPal was also a little bit of a story. I had interviewed with PayPal maybe 2 or 3 years back for a contract role, and I didn't get it. For whatever reason, it didn't work out. Absolutely fine. I decided to shoot my shot 2 to 3 years later to the at the time she was the director. At the time I was interviewing, she was the manager. So she had upgraded by that point. So did I, right? I reached back out and said, "Hey, I know that you interviewed me a couple years back. I'm ready to apply for this new role. I would love for you to check me out with my new experience." And she put me through to get an interview. And so it was really just that lukewarm, warm contact, shooting your shot, quite honestly, that helps me, and especially in the climate that we have right now where you are qualified and you will apply and get rejected in 10 minutes. These lukewarm connections are going to help you so much.
That's amazing. And if you're just joining us, it's Maleea and I talking about UX research and our journey from psychology into UX research, working for some of the top companies and giving a lot of gems about, that I think are going to honestly help a lot of people, especially what you were just sharing about, reaching out, taking action when you feel like it, not waiting because it might be too late by the time you get around to it. So, going, essentially from an associate, and advancing as much as you have in your career in such a short time, are there challenges that come with that?
Yeah, could you elaborate a little bit more?
So, like, I understand, like, across different companies, there's like, different contexts across, like, also like different roles of seniority. There's different expectations, right? And sometimes, like, you have to live up to those expectations, right? It
Mhm.
can be challenging. So, is that something that you've experienced in your career, or like, has it just been like smooth sailing?
I wish it was smooth sailing, right? I would love to talk to the person who had a smooth sailing tech experience, but I would say definitely working at that level comes up, right? Of like wanting to grow. And I think, especially in the UX space, growing means taking on more ownership or higher level projects. And sometimes, I guess it's kind of hard to speak to because I guess I'm thinking about the times in which I had asked for more work and I got more work, but maybe I could have benefited from more guidance with that work
Mm.
or with structure and framework. Because sometimes, and I say sometimes, it is actually quite often, you will come with a request to do some work and the work is very ambiguous. And I think that that's something that's kind of standard across tech and across different roles as well. That can be challenging, especially as a researcher, where we're faced with literally just a question. You have one question, and we have to figure out how to answer that question, right? And sometimes the means of answering that question is above our means or above, like, or maybe just, yeah, it's quite simply just above our means, but something that we still have to figure out regardless. So I would say that that issue is there. Um, the ambiguity piece, I think, is kind of standard by this point, and I would I would say that is when you keep going through different companies, different projects, different teams, you start to get a better sense of how you want to proceed when it comes to this. But yeah, I would say that that is definitely something that comes up in our space, taking on more than what you probably can, and especially when it comes to research. I will leave on this last piece. We tend to have less researchers per design pod group, whatever you want to call it. It will usually be maybe one or two designers, maybe a content writer, a researcher. And so usually that researcher has, 5 to 6 stakeholders as well. So that can also be very challenging when trying to like narrow in a scope for something. So definitely exists, but I would say that it's a lot of the very like tactical work that we do as researchers.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and it's so interesting that you were just saying that, especially the piece about UX writing, because the a LinkedIn user doesn't say your name, sorry, but says this is really awesome as a new UX writer looking for tips when getting into the industry. It's
Hmm.
interesting that Maleea and I were talking about how this podcast was set up to be a resource, and that's another like another example of that happening in real time. Um, so do you have a framework for for the kind of opportunities that you look for, how you approach it? Because it almost seemed like, for example, like your role at PayPal, your current role, like you were very targeted in the way that you went about that. Do you have a strategy for it, or how does that work out typically?
And you mean for like just new roles in general?
Just new roles, like what are you typically looking for when you're searching for new roles, and how can other people think about, maybe use that as a framework about how they think about opportunities that they go for?
Yeah, I think that when I'm looking for new roles, I like to look for any sort of connection that I have. And if I don't have a connection, I make one. And I think that's really key as far as networking goes. And in this climate where we are, and it's really hard to land an interview, I should say, but like let alone land a role. Leaning on your network and your community is going to be super, super big. As I mentioned, I knew the director from PayPal because I had interviewed with her before. I didn't have insight into the team or anything, but even that little connection was enough for me to get my foot in the door for the interview and then proceed on with myself to be able to get the role. So um, I would say that that's like one of the larger pieces. Yeah, is leaning on your network. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I specifically do when it comes to like looking for new roles. I guess I could speak on the piece about if I don't know, right? Like if it's like it's cold now, it's cold, reach out and I need to figure out how I'm going to make it warm. There's a lot of different ways that you can try networking to make this easier for you. So like you have a company in mind and you've seen the role, you already know. What I like to do is start with LinkedIn because that's a really great way to connect with people. But start with the company, people within the company, and then people within the company that share something with you. So whether that's like we both went to the same conference that some conference recently, or we both live in Chicago, or maybe we both went to the University of Cincinnati, like whatever that piece is, connect with people because people like to talk about themselves. And so find that piece, connect with people, and then try to see if there's a way for you to talk about the role or figure out the people that are needed for you to learn about that role. And that's a really great way because you now have a warm connect at the company, maybe even a friend, which we could all use more friends, you know what I mean? Like more people that we can connect with. And so even if you don't get the role, you know someone at that company now. Like keep connecting with them. You literally never know what that person can do for you or what you can do for them. So networking, I would say, is like very, very big. It's the first thing that I take a look at before even getting into a role, unless I'm like just cold applying across the board. If I'm targeted and strategic, that's going to be the first way for me to get started.
So just to double click on that, which has been more, it almost seems like being more targeted has been more successful for you overall. But is there a right or wrong answer? Like, have you, just maybe from your experience, from other people's experience around you, like, is there a right or wrong answer, whether it's like targeted or be more strategic?
If I had to give, I would say being targeted will help you, but I do understand that being targeted means taking the additional time to like do the research on the company, maybe even um, target your resume so that it actually fits or the portfolio even. That's something that I've done before where my case studies that I'm planning to show out are actually geared towards the company that I'm applying for so that it kind of already mimics, you know, what they would expect from me if I was to be in that role. So I'm definitely a team targeted, team strategy. I think it'll feel better because you spent the time to develop your case for this company or wherever it whatever role this is. And I guess it's like a I can see it be a double-edged sword because if you were to get rejected from something that you put that time and effort in, it would hurt a little bit more than if you just like applied and you got the rejection. But I personally, and I think a lot of people might say this as well, have a lot of success, more success, I guess I should say, when we are targeting. So I would say yes, and maybe that means just like working with somebody so that you can best do this. That's another thing that I will double click on is like getting feedback from anybody, honestly, is huge. And the more that you're able to let feedback in, the more you'll be able to work more quickly to make whatever change that needs to be. Maybe it's your resume, it's not getting past ATS, or maybe you get into the interview and you're doing your portfolio review and you don't really have all the pieces that you need to articulate your exact role in that project or whatever the case may be. So yeah, yeah, targeted, I would say.
And speaking of, one of the things that you talked about is like leaning on your network. But for a lot of people who are new in tech, they don't even have that network, right? So how do you go about building one? I know you talked about LinkedIn, but is there something specific? Is it just like adding everybody up, or like is there a way to do it?
hmm Well, when I first got started, I literally would just like cold send out messages to people. And my process in the beginning was okay, I'm interested in potentially maybe being at Microsoft or Google, with these places. And I find that there's nothing to lose when you reach out to people. The worst they can say is nothing, like not even a no. Like the worst they can say is not replying to you. And so you really don't have much to lose when it comes to like reaching out to people. And I had some success, right? Not everybody reached back out to me that I reached out to. Maybe, let's say I put out 10, maybe 4 or 5 reached back out. So 50%. But it really just takes one person that you can connect with and has the resources that you need to be able to like really push yourself forward. So I was able to talk to quite a few people, right? Because 5 out of 10. And it was simply me reaching out saying, "Hey, I'm interested in UX research. I'm new and I'd love to just understand what this space is like. If you have any time, let's meet." That's a very, very, very like abstracted way of me talking about it. Maybe if you were to send a message, you might want to add like, "I did this," and whatever, like whatever that piece is. I remember earlier I mentioned that if you have something to connect with them on, this is actually the time to bring that up as well. And yeah, so then I was able to connect with people. I was able to connect on a little bit of a deeper level, and a lot of people gave me great resources, and some of them became my mentors even from there.
Wow, that's pretty cool. That's amazing. And what did you find to be like very useful in like this relationship building process? Right? Because again, one of the things that I hear a lot, on this stream is like how you can't just be take, take, take. What's the way to give back when you don't really have a lot to give?
That's a hard one. I think that's also something that I struggled with and maybe still struggle with to this day. The way that I have decided to do it is thinking back to when I was earlier in my journey. I was always trying to figure out if there was a way for me to give back. 'Cause I'm like, "You're giving me so many gems, you're giving me your time, all of these things. Is there something that I can do?" And usually they would say, "No, there's literally nothing you can do." And I was always like, "Okay, I guess, I'll keep reaching back out, see if there's something that I can do for you." But I feel like what I'm doing right now is the actual thing that is giving back, that is more useful than me giving back to any one person that has already helped me. They've already gotten that help, that feedback, everything that they gave me, they also got it. So I don't feel like when I talk to people that they need to give me anything. Like if anything, take what you got from me and pass it on to somebody else because that's actually going to be much more impactful than, you buying me coffee or, like whatever thing that you feel like you need to compensate me for. And so, yeah, I would say that when you're starting your journey, realizing that there isn't a whole lot you can do for other people and just being okay with that. But if you truly care about giving back, do it once you're in a good spot to do so.
That's really helpful, and I guess something that could even be helpful potentially, like even like thinking about it, because ultimately I think you already did two things you didn't really think about it as doing, but asking, right? I think is
That too.
one. Being
Putting yourself out there to ask.
understand they might not take anything from you, but are you even aware that you could ask and maybe they might come up with something? And then two is potentially like, you know, coming back. Because I think one of the things that I find out that it's so funny how it works in like economics of scale if you think about it. Nobody wants to give away 30 minutes of their time. That's just going to go to waste.
That's just
So in a way,
uh-huh.
actually coming back for more makes that first 30 minutes cheaper, right? Because ultimately they know that they're contributing that time towards something that's going to, so you're right. Like you being in a position that you can even do this as paid for everything, right?
Yeah,
Because
completely.
ultimately whatever time they put in paid off. I think it's more painful when it's 30 minutes that's just gone. That's not coming back.
Yeah.
And I think those are the two things that I see even in your story as ways that you've been able to like give back beyond like even being here and sharing with other people who clearly it's already impacting. Um,
Yeah.
so you mentioned coffee, right? And coffee chats was something that you said has been valuable. Can you expand more on that?
Yeah. So you would also ask me like how exactly I might go about this. So I like to have some templates of messages kind of like queued up. Different types of messages, right? Sometimes I'm messaging a researcher on the team, and that looks a little bit different than the recruiter or the hiring manager. But keeping that similar structure of this is me. This is why I'm connecting with you, and this is our connection, like our connection as well. That tends to help a lot because if you're just straight to the point, you send a message to, like you just mentioned, we're all very busy. If you send a message and it's just like a hey, hi, how you doing? It's like, okay, how can I help you? Right? Like, can you please get to the point and to the message so that we can both get to the thing faster? And as I mentioned earlier, having that connection piece also really helps to solidify that, okay, you also like read my profile or whatever the case may be, you actually care. So yeah, I would say that those are kind of like the pieces that I would say.
Yeah. And so I'm currently in a culture that values coffee chats a lot, right? Like you can talk to someone else on a different team, working on a different project, even like in a different business unit entirely. I think that's something that you also mentioned, kind of like in your bio. Like, what's the value of having a coffee chat, and how can that be beneficial to people currently like on their journey into tech?
Invaluable, I would say, actually. As I mentioned earlier, you get to talk to people, you get to understand. I guess there's so much you can glean from a conversation, but you get to understand them, which can be interesting, right? If you're that type of person that, cares to learn about people. You learn about the company, usually because if you're talking about the role that is itself, you're getting more about how the company sees that role. There's also industry talk in that, right? Like you get to understand on a broader scale, okay, this is the company, but like how is it funneling into the industry as a whole for this role? You also can potentially make a deeper connection, like I mentioned earlier, and that's the one thing that'll really help you when it comes to like years or months or years down the line, right? Where you did connect with somebody, maybe you don't talk to them all the time, but you remember you had that connection and whatever that was. So you reach back out to them and you're able to like keep that ball rolling and that rapport. So that is really instrumental, I would say. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think if there are some other pieces in particular, but yeah, I guess I'll keep it right there for now.
Okay. Well, again, thanks everyone for joining. We've been having such a great time. I hope you've been learning a lot. I've been learning a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Once we get to like, I think 15 to 20 minutes before the end, we'll start to take questions from the audience. But for right now, I have all the time, so I'm going to ask the questions. um, so, one of the things that I know, okay, before I get to that question, actually, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't talk about enough, I think you have actually like entered it a few times, so I definitely want to go into it a little deeper, is learning in tech is one thing. I think that's what a lot of people focus on. Oh, we'll teach you how to become this in 90 days or 40 days and like you'll be on your way. But a lot of people don't actually talk about how actually getting that role, especially that first role, is a full-time job in and of itself. And I want you to talk about the experience. In fact, let's talk about the experience first, because the second question is just as important. What does that look like, from like your own journey perspective?
Yeah, getting the first role is the hardest. And I think it depends on where you're coming from. If you are, well, I'll speak from my perspective. So I didn't come from like an internship or entry level per se. I had work experience and I was transferring over. And, I was actually talking to somebody about this earlier today. I did a boot camp, as I mentioned earlier. It was with um, Career Foundry. I was going to like mix the two names together. It's Career Foundry. And we had mentors. And so each week I would meet with my mentor and we would go over my work, whatever, talking about career things, so many things to chat about, really. And I remember one week I brought up an article that I had read, and essentially it was about a woman who had pursued a boot camp in UX design and got scouted for a role before she finished. And I was like, oh, I would love that to be me. I would love to be able to just like get a role and not need to like or just like whatever, just I would love to be at that point so that I could secure the role that I wanted to get without needing to do all of these extra things. And so I said, how can I do that? How can I be at that level? And this was maybe 3 or 4 months into this 10-month engagement with the boot camp. And my mentor said, okay, Maleea, if you're interested in getting scouted, you definitely need a portfolio. So going back on this idea of being prepared or just having the pieces that you need, I just started immediately. I was like, okay, well, I'm not finished with my case study yet, but I will start getting a portfolio together so I can understand what this looks like and how I can funnel into it once I'm ready to do so. And so I started working on my portfolio. It was very hard. It was like the very first time that I was doing this piece, and I finished it maybe, a month or so down the line. So still within like this 10-month engagement. And I had my portfolio and my resume ready. So I said, okay, I guess I'll start shooting my shot. Like, let me see if I'm even getting any bites. And I think that's a very UX way of doing it, putting it out there, see if it works, breaking it if it doesn't, iterating if that's the case. And so that's exactly what I did. So I started putting my resume out there. If ATS got me, cool. I'm heading on to the next round. Awesome. It's not my resume. If I'm getting to the interview process and I'm not doing so great, maybe I should think about my answers to the questions. Or if it's like the case studies, am I, putting, am I giving all the pieces that the hiring manager and this team need so that they can best evaluate me? And so it was a lot of iterations, right? Like putting myself out there, failing, and taking that time to say, okay, I failed, but there's a path forward. And just being clear in that it's not about you, it's just about the pieces that you need to present. Like they're your pieces, but it's not like you are a rejection. It's that, hey, we don't quite understand how your skill set aligns. So you need to just reshape what that looks like so that it actually works best for you. So getting a rejection hurts. It's not great, but try to learn from it. And there's usually something to learn from it. Even if you don't get feedback from them, you can try to think about like, where am I in the journey? Like I mentioned earlier, is it at the beginning of the journey I'm not even getting a call back? Or there are different things that you can diagnose at that point. But I would say that's kind of how I would go about it.
You said it amazingly. And you know what's so interesting? I literally made a piece of content this week saying it exactly as you said it.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like if you make a resume and you don't send it out, that's the best resume in the world. Before you even get any feedback on it, if you send it 100 times or 150 times and you don't get any callbacks, you will go back to that resume and start looking at what's wrong with it.
Yep.
And then I think in that process, without even getting any direct feedback, you're almost able to self audit. Why? Because you're testing it against something and it's
Hmm.
not giving the result. So you're able to diagnose. And it's like, it's so important to just like continually test and iterate. I think you said it best.
Very
Every
true.
step in the journey is a process, and you have to get good at that. That's actually why I split the question into two, because I did want to ask the second part.
Oh yeah.
Applying itself is a journey, but interviewing is even much more so.
Yeah.
As somebody who's been on both sides, both as somebody hiring and somebody getting hired multiple times,
Yeah.
you know, how important is it to get good at interviewing?
So important. So important. As you just mentioned, and I think I also tried to articulate this before, but like getting your foot in the door with your resume is one thing, and the interview process is a completely different thing. Um, you will definitely need to take the time to understand how to best answer these questions, right? A lot of people are very skilled at interviewing and communicating their value and their worth. So if you don't prepare, it's going to be very hard for you to shine. Hmm.
That's
And
really. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah,
I
sorry, I
think you
was
wanted to
also
say
going to
something.
just, yeah, I was going to add that as far as preparing and what that looks like, I would say leaning on the people that you've tried to connect with, right? So that's like people you have either reached out to or people that you actually know, and doing things like mock interviews. Great way to get a better understanding. Actually, it's a great way to literally test yourself because it's actually more testing than just like, oh, did I answer the question? You're in the interview process, more or less, and giving that answer. So very important, so important. And you have to take a look at both of these steps individually. The first step is having all your deliverables, all of your assets, which is your resume, portfolio, your code stack, like whatever that is. And then the second part is completely thinking about, okay, and I think that this is probably true across the board for tech, but like behavioral questions are definitely the ones that will trip you up. Especially if you were transferring in, you need to study them because if you didn't work in tech, how will you be able to understand how to answer those behavioral situational questions? You have to understand how they relate to your own work and then have your answer then. So yeah, absolutely, very important both pieces.
That is so important. And it's like there's so many little elements in there like that I realize is so important. For example, like are you even speaking the lingo? Because you might be saying the exact thing you need to say, but if you're not saying it the way the interviewers want to hear it, that could be something else. Like for example, it's like,
Hmm.
oh, but are you supposed to say stakeholders and not saying stakeholders? And it's not like I don't think there's a specific word they're looking for, but if it comes together,
But
it's
the
like that's
jargon,
the answer.
yeah, the jargon has to feel good, right? So yeah.
Yeah, that's so important. So one thing that people are always very interested in is like, you know, money, right? What does salary progression look like, for UX roles or UX research roles in tech?
Yeah, for me, um, getting started, I was a contractor, right? So it was an hourly rate and I didn't have any benefits. So had my rate. I believe the agency that I was working with had, like the baseline benefits, but I had to pay into it. So, you know, that's usually how that tends to work. And my second role, which was also a contract role, it was hourly again, but in this instance, the agency had benefits baked in, and so I didn't really have to pay out for that. So that was nice. I was able to pocket a little bit more money this time. Here at PayPal, I have what we would call like a full compensation package, which includes base, stock, and bonus for us. So My compensation grew quite a lot when I moved from contract to full-time rate. I got all of the benefits as well as stocks, and there's a bonus now. So it's quite a bump from just base, which is what the hourly rate would be, just your base.
Yeah, yeah. I actually made a video about contract versus full time. It's on the channel, so you go check it out. I think but you covered it very succinctly, right? So last question before we go into the audience question, because I see we already have one. Is what are the skills and certifications? Because you had talked about like self learning and like building up that stack. If somebody wanted to become a UX researcher today, completely green, like what would they need to know to even be able to get into those conversations?
hmm hmm If you wanted to start today, and I think it looks different depending on where you are in your life, honestly. Like, if you were me and you were somebody who was just trying to transfer over, I would say that the biggest things you're going to need right now are experience. You have the skill set, you just don't have the UX experience per se to speak to. And so that's going to be doing potentially not my favorite, but pro bono work or work that's maybe in your community um, that you can decide to put forward there, or it's getting these contract roles where you're working on project basis so that you can work with a business and get that experience so you can speak to it. I've actually had a few people reach out to me recently and they're like, hey, how do I get started? And in order for people to trust you, like a hiring manager or somebody on the team to trust you with doing the research, you have to show that you've done it before. And even if you've done like adjacent work in other areas, you will still have to have some sort of like project or some sort of use case or case study so you can say, I understand this process of a problem and a methodology and then going about it and then actually having like um, findings or insights or what are the difference between those two even because there is like all of those pieces. um, I would say that that's going to help you because self-learning and trying to understand all of the nuances of a project and what could go wrong with a project as well is really hard to do unless you're in it. So put yourself in
Hmm.
it, whether that's a free option, which is not my favorite. It is a way for you to get quick project experience. But if you're able to finagle like a project based work where it's like an agency, I've done that before where I've worked with an agency on like task based work for projects that maybe only spanned a couple months, but it was great for me to be like, hey, I did that thing and I know how this thing works. So um, for those of us who are transferring over, I would say that that's going to be really helpful. If it's about us who are like entry level, like we're new to working, or we are coming from academia, I would say networking is going to be top for you. Entry level, I think, is very similar to like just transferring over because you would still need to get like that experience, but networking especially because um, well, I'll say networking a little bit more for interns in particular. I have not interned, so this is just me giving my anecdotal, piece for those who are coming in through that way. But I do think that right now, networking is going to be like the name of the game. Lots of people are pursuing degrees and are looking for internships. So in order to stand out, you probably need to know somebody as well as potentially having a portfolio, excuse me, which is that's another topic of discussion because as researchers, it's not like the thing that we should have, but as a UX function, I believe we just have them because people want to see our work. So yeah, I would say project work is going to help you a ton in understanding the space so that you can answer those questions, those behavioral and situational pieces that are going to come up. And then if you're like really green, networking is going to be really important for you so that you can know the people or know the spaces that you need to be in so that you're even able to do the projects, right? So yeah, definitely twofold.
So it's interesting that you say that, and I'm gonna go to Shauna's question right after this. But Are there courses that are considered like, the gold standard or like the must know in the UX space? I know like for cloud, for example, like, you have to take like the foundational certifications that's GCP or AWS. Are they similar for like UX research?
I I guess so. I guess I could say that NNG or Nielsen Norman Group is like the area that a lot of us would go to for very basic level like UX skills and resources, but it's not um I wouldn't say that that's the only place that you can go to get quality information. Lots of information is available online when it comes to UX, and depending on what UX we're talking about, it could be design, it could be research, and there's content, as somebody had mentioned earlier. Um, it's I think that there's no one area where you can get the best information that you can. What I will say though is that having a mentor in this space is going to be instrumental because they can probably help you funnel through all of that noise, right? Tons of things do exist, many things you can read through online. As I mentioned, NNG is pretty big, but working with somebody who knows you and knows your skill set can help you understand what you actually need to take a look at. You don't need to read everything, you don't need to do everything. Maybe you've actually already had that experience. What you really need to just strengthen your communication or your storytelling. Okay, great. So how can I do that rather than, oh, let me go back to the basics of looking at research design. I know that already, as a researcher, right? Potentially. So what do you actually need? And then take the time to learn or latch onto that piece so that you're able to actually up level yourself and grow.
Hmm. Okay, so over to audience questions. Shauna, sorry, you've been waiting for a second, but do you have any tips? I think it's for portfolios, and I think you were talking about that. So that's actually a nice segue. I have academia research, and I have taken courses on UXR, but it's just hard starting one off and not being sure if it's correct.
Hmm. Yeah, when it comes to getting started with research use or use cases or anything that you're putting on your portfolio for UXR, um, I will suggest taking a look at, you know, using Google as your friend. But I will say that what hiring managers are typically looking for when it comes to portfolios for UX research is just a few key things really, and everything else will kind of like fall in between. So they want to know, what is your problem? Like what was the thing you were trying to do with this project in the first place? Like, why are we here? The next thing they would want to know is, how did you go about doing it? So this is like your method. What was your method? How'd you go about doing the method? Did you involve other people? Were there any hiccups, or, what was the process like? And it's usually about them just truly trying to understand, what was your thought process, right? Are you just somebody that's like, okay, here's a project and I just go through it and it's finished? Or are you able to really think about the implications of this? Or did you come up with this and you understand the context that was here beforehand and that brought you here? So they're really just trying to assess, like, who are you and how does your brain function? And then the third thing that I would say is really important. So we've got context, like, what did you do? And then what was the impact of that thing? So it was this problem. You decided to do this method. What came out of it? We like to say, what is the so what of what you did? And that, I think those three pieces are most important. Of course, everything else that comes with it is going to be important. You'll want to speak to, like, what was your role in this? And, like all of the other pieces that you might see when it comes to looking online for other research portfolios. But those are the three pieces that I would say would help you get started in understanding where you need to go as far as your portfolio goes.
Hmm. That's really helpful. Um, LinkedIn user says, I think this was your answer initially about like you landing a job. I missed part of it. How long was it before you landed your first position?
Yes. So I was doing the boot camp, and like I mentioned earlier, I did my portfolio, ended up getting a role before then. So the time from me completing my portfolio to the time that I got the first full-time contract role, I would say it was 4 months. Mhm. 4 months. And I'm somebody who works really quickly. And so that I wouldn't say that that's something that is common. And especially right now, it feels like it takes so much longer to get up and running with that. But it did take me 4-ish months. So that was 4 months of me iterating on my portfolio and my resume, continuing to network, even though, sometimes it doesn't go somewhere, that'll happen. Doing all those things and being persistent and consistent, I should say, helped me,
Mm.
even though it was hard. Um, it's a lot of work to put in, but you will get a lot out of it as well.
And I think that's both a great question and a great answer. Shauna says, thank you. Yeah, thanks for asking the question.
Yes.
And I say that because it's like, one of the things that I was still saying it to someone earlier today is like, I'm not really mad at the people who say the 90 days, six figures and things like that, even though I
Mhm.
don't think it's fully true, like, as you and I know. But at the very minimum, I think it's getting the interest up and it's getting more people who would naturally not have looked at it. And I think like, people can then come to like, forums like this to learn about what the real is because
Yeah.
I can see why, even though it's a positive to get more people interested, I think the negative is that if people don't know what the reference is, right? Like you probably had people in your network who gave you that context and like you're sharing that context is like, hey, right now, even 4 months might seem like a long time, but it's not really because I worked hard and did all that. I think it prepares people mentally, right, to understand exactly what it takes.
Right.
And I think a lot of people wouldn't even mind if they knew the truth because it's like we went to school for like almost 20 years
Right.
just to be able to
Like,
get a degree that sometimes doesn't give you the outcome. So if you think
true.
about 4 months or even 12 months or 24 in comparison to that, it's not a
Mhm.
long time. And oftentimes it's like, I'm sorry to say, people, it doesn't get any easier, but the good
Yeah.
thing is once you've done a lot of that foundational work of building that what a solid resume is and the market, which is like recruiters, hiring managers validated, you now have the platform. So you might still have to do it as many times, but you're not doing it guessing now. You know exactly what works. And I think that's the difference. So you're basically, in that
Mhm.
first part, you're basically building a platform that's going to take you throughout your entire career. And I think that's why
Totally.
that work is important.
Yeah, I would say that's exactly what it is. By this point now, I understand how to structure my resume. It's very easy for me to go back and make some tweaks based off of updates of things that I've done. I already know what the portfolio looks like or what it should look like and what it is expected of it, even if I don't have it exactly, spelt out in that way. So, yeah, absolutely. Like very, very, very important pieces there.
Yeah. Hey, good evening, Elisha. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. She says, thank you for this chat. Amazing gems. Do you know if it's possible to land a role with a portfolio that consists only bootcamp projects?
That's a good question. I think that if the bootcamp use cases or the pieces from the bootcamp, the projects themselves, are structured in a way that gives the hiring manager what they want, yes. But it seems that the way that boot camp projects had been structured in the past was very cookie cutter. And so it's almost like predictable of what it's going to look like. And that predictability is not the thing that they're actually looking for either. Not the predictability itself, but like them predicting what's going to be on it and knowing that the pieces that are there are not the ones that they need, it is going to hurt you. So I would say that it's not about it being from a boot camp per se. I mean, of course, if you have projects that are with companies that have a little bit more of that business acumen, it's going to go further than a boot camp or, a project that's kind of like on the side. But if that's all that you have, still presented in that way, like what was the problem? Because again, I think what they're really trying to understand is how do you think? And especially if you don't have that experience yet, it's like, okay, great, you're interested in this space. How does your mind go about thinking of how this project needs to go through? Or what are you thinking about at the end? Or, what are all those pieces that's going through your mind? That's actually most important. So if you're able to articulate those through those things that I mentioned earlier, like the context, what you did, and then what did you get out of it. I think that that's actually going to take you very far. So maybe it's tweaking what you have on like the boot camp project, but I do think that that's still something that you can use. I've used it. I know many. I'm not exclusive to this. There are many people who've gone through boot camps and used their pieces to land roles, but I think it's all about how you position it.
And that is very valid advice, especially like combined with what you said earlier about like, the structure of it. If I could just add a little bit of something, I think there's no right or wrong. Of course, like if you have actual like business scenario, like you said, that is perfect. But I
Yes.
think one way to take it a bit further is that even if from like a business perspective is not fully fleshed out, and again, I don't really know so much about like UX research portfolios, I think but just portfolios in general. And I had somebody give this example. So he was in data analytics and he wanted to build a project for his portfolio. So he literally went and was trying to buy used cars. So he pulled data from a used car website within a certain location, put
Yeah.
it into an Excel, ran pivot tables, found the exact thing that it was looking for, and then sold that as a project and it got the job. I think there's something to be said about adding a bit of like personality to it and adding something that makes sense for your own context. Because just like you said, the problem with cookie cutter isn't necessarily cookie cutter. It's that the directive and the flow of it comes from like something that's top to bottom, which
Right.
means that when you run into challenges and that they're trying to challenge your assumptions, you're not really able to speak to it because that wasn't your
It wasn't
project.
your
If you really
problem.
think
It
about it,
wasn't, yeah, you just like picked it up. And so you're like, oh, whatever problem wasn't my problem. Right? It wasn't my project. But you will need to speak to those things. Absolutely.
because and to your point, like in the used car example, like if they ask you, oh, so why didn't you use this type of cars instead? Well, you could say because like I was only looking for a sedan, so I narrowed my search to that. Whereas if they asked you that in a cookie cutter project, you
Hmm.
might get to an answer, but you will struggle to get to that answer, right? So it's like
Right.
owning, even if it's that, even if you don't go do anything extra, I think having that ownership and thinking about that project as if this was something that you were working multiple problems, not just like we had this problem set, we solved it, done. But it's
Hmm.
like, are you bringing other external factors to think into how you work through that problem to get there? I think, yeah,
Exactly.
ultimately. But yeah, I think you said it perfectly.
And especially as a
So yeah,
researcher, it's all about your thought process and how does that funnel through. Hmm.
I think in your yeah, exactly. In that case, it's even more important because I think psychology being the base, as you said, and like being a researcher, you the biggest skill that you bring is not just taking anything at surface level.
Exactly. It's being curious and saying, okay, wait a minute, taking that step back even when everybody wants to go forward. So, yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
So I know we're at time. I definitely want to be respectful of your time, but that's not before, we give you the chance to share any last words, promote anything that's coming, upcoming, anything you're looking forward to, or just any words of encouragement in general.
Yeah, nothing coming up for me, but it's hard right now for a lot of people trying to get into tech. I would say keep pushing, but be smart. Have a strategy. If we don't have a strategy, I think it's going to be really hard for you to make that transition, whether that's like mid-level transition or entry level intern level transition. So that's one piece. Reach out to people. I found that a lot of people in the UX space in particular, I'm not sure if this goes across the board, are very happy to spend their time like helping people because all of us have been there. We've all been in their spot and trying to figure out what we can do to like help each other, right? And we were in that position of not being able to give back. So it's really a gift for us to be able to share the knowledge that we have. So reach out, send a message though, because that helps. But reach out, people will most likely want to help you, especially if you're in the right headspace and you're ready to do it. They'll probably also be ready to help you too, because we all feel good when people win, right? Like we're already in our roles, right? Like you and I, but like if we're able to help somebody else, that's so much more satisfactory than me getting my insights heard, like from my team. Like, okay, great. They were going to listen to my insights regardless because I'm on the team. But like, somebody else getting a role because of like pieces that they've heard from us or from me or something that I gave them, it is like elating. So yeah. I would say just go for it. Put yourself out there. Doesn't always feel good, but especially in tech, that's something you'll want to like get acquainted with. But really, put yourself out there. It'll help in, I think, not even just in the realm of tech, but just like how you approach your life. I don't want to get too deep, but I will leave on that piece.
That is, I just wanted to read a few comments. Makes sense. Thank you. That's great advice. Great session, guys. Thank you all so much for the insight. And I think it's been coming like that way all night. Thank you so much, Maleea. This has been absolutely amazing. I think it's extremely valuable learning about your journey, learning about, even the struggles, the setbacks, the challenges, but ultimately, like, showing that at the end of the day, it's always worth it if you stick with it. I think that's the biggest lesson that I learned, and like leaning heavily on your network and like not doing this journey on your own, especially in this very difficult time.
Yeah, you don't have to, so don't, right?
Yeah, that's the stream for tonight. I think we have like 2 episodes coming next week. I think 3 actually. So a
Ooh.
lot of goodies coming your way. We're working on the way to episode 50. It's 46 tonight. Thank you all. We really had a great time tonight, and I hope to see you next week.